Now we can listen to our next presenter, Professor Balázs Mezei, who will speak about Patocka and scruton.
So thank you very much, Ákos, for the kind invitation. Perhaps it is a mistake of genres, but I just produced a paper. I'm going to read this out. I mean the paraphrased form of it, and so not going to be very long. Okay, so as you see, this is the title, so a little bit different from what you can see in the program. Patocka and scruton on Europe. Okay, yes, this is not a real PPT, just some quotations from my text. So it's not something very helpful, but anyway. So Europe today is in the midst of an even more radical transformation than it was 34 years ago. Before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Europe existed in a state of political and cultural schizophrenia. The West, under the dominance of the NATO and the EU, was entering its post-classical period in which the outlines of a new civilization were being drawn. The East existed under Soviet rule, where the official Marxism barely masked the disorientation of both the population and its intelligentsia. The West was confident in its technological superiority and cultural diversity. The East almost completely lost its self-respect as a result of the revolts in Berlin, Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw, revolts and revolutions that failed to achieve their desired goals. The historical dynamic of the West can be compared to a centrifugal movement. It spread, its culture gradually gained global influence, and the ideas of freedom, democracy, and liberal culture seemed to be the only desirable path for humanity. In contrast, the East followed a centripetal movement. It gradually abandoned the original Marxist ideas and began to copy the West or Western patterns, but at a primitive level and without real success. Not only was the world bipolar, but the East was particularly so. Behind the scenes of ideology, the everyday reality of Soviet impregnated societies was bleak, hopeless, unable to find a way out of its depressing stagnation. In this situation, the historical and geographical importance of Central Europe almost completely disappeared. The old centers of Central European culture, Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Krakow, lived in a shadowy existence in which the memory of past achievements was perhaps alive in the minds of some, but their continuation was hardly followed. The schizophrenia of the West-East split left no room for a true revival of the Central European spirit that had produced the highest accomplishment in music, literature, science, and philosophy. In this situation, those who represented the low Central European spirit had a hard time. Bibo in Budapest, Patocka in Prague, Tischner in Krakow, Better in Cluj, Zoltán Better, and many others who were representatives of this spirituality, and those who understood the importance of the center, such as Roger Scruton, were naturally interested in the traditions of Central Europe. Scruton's approach to Central Europe was shaped by his interest in classical music. The most important composers at the center, such as Liszt, Dvorak, Janáček, Bartók, Kodály, and others, created something that continued the classical traditions in a new way that was neither anti-traditionalist nor anti-modernist. In their own way, they created a balance between the old and the new, where true creativity was able to find new ways for real achievement. In other fields, it was more difficult to find similar avenues. Yes. Similar avenues. In philosophy, for example, the exclusivity of Marxism didn't allow scholars and thinkers to develop independent philosophical forms. Even Georg Lukács who broke with his earlier cultural past, was suspect in the eyes of the party rulers for his attempts to renew Marxism. And a similar fate awaited Adam Schaff or Leszek Kolakowski in Poland, and so on. After 1945, Patocka had only a few years to teach at a university. As a translator and librarian, his philosophical ideas could hardly be published in his homeland. He was not allowed to develop independent philosophical ideas. Instead, he studied the writings of Aristotle, translated Aristotle, and Comenius. Still a good way to understand history, but less so when one is called to think in new ways. So some words on Patocka's views on Europe. Patocka's approach to the meaning of and importance of Europe can be described as classicist. This means that the classical authors, such as Plato and Aristotle, play a decisive role in his understanding. He views the idea of Europe from the perspective of enduring importance of classical authors, first and foremost Plato, and interprets the subsequent development of the idea of Europe as the unfolding of this legacy. The care of the soul, sorge für die Seele, péče o duši, appears here as the decisive expression. Patocka understands this concept as the care of the integrity of the human person, or human persons, in the sense of his or her total devotion to the truth. To understand this point properly, we must see that in Soviet-occupied Central Europe, truth took on a mythical dimension. Since the Soviet oppression was based on a complex structure of lies, on the distortion of historical, intellectual, and spiritual facts, on the banning of past and present authors, the thirst for truth became suffocating. Patocka interpreted European history on this basis. He made a sharp distinction between the internalist, truth-seeking attitude and the externalist, power-obsessed attitude. This truth-oriented philosophical attitude stands in sharp contrast to the externalist attitude, which tries to replace the need for the care of the soul with an external, hegemonic drive. Europe has existed in the tension between the externalist and the internalist attitudes, but it has always been the devotion to truth and its application in the care of the soul that has supported positive developments in its history. For Patocka, it was the practice of the care of the soul that constituted the true identity of Europe. From this perspective, Europe is like a double helix. One helix is represented by Socrates and his commitment to truth. The other helix is represented by Thrasymachus, who sees truth as the right of the strong and powerful. For Plato, the dialogue between Socrates and Thrasymachus in the Republic leads to the defeat of Thrasymachus, so that by the end of the dialogue, he becomes a supporter of Socrates. However, this dramatic development does not mean that Thrasymachus is not needed in the dialogue or in the history of Europe. On the contrary, Socrates defines himself in terms of the Thrasymachian principle, that is, in opposition to the principle of the violence of the powerful, and outlines the path of the philosopher in terms of such an opposition. It is in this opposition that a total devotion to truth, becomes possible. The genome of Europe is constituted by this double spiral, but it is always the pure devotion to truth that creates the possibility of true progress. This progress cannot be realized without the highest form of self-giving of the philosopher. This devotion can take the form of death, as described by Plato and the authors of the Gospels. Socrates faced 3 accusers in the Apology, Jesus faced Judas, and Patocka faced some unnamed traitors who informed the secret police about his deeds and thoughts. Patocka, like Socrates, gave his life for the truth, proving the power of the powerless one of his important expressions. The strength of the righteous soul against the power of unjust oppression. So some words on Scruton's views on Europe. Roger Scruton saw Europe somewhat differently. As an Englishman, can we say so? Was he? As an Englishman, sorry. Dr. Herha is going to speak about the Englishman in Central Europe. As an Englishman, he viewed Europe from an Atlanticist perspective in which many developments on the continent seemed dubious, if not dangerous. He lived in Paris when the student revolts broke out in 1968 and witnessed the dissolution of order and morality. This shocking experience turned him against Marxism, or Marxist and liberal ideologies that supported such dissolution, revolt, and even revolution, and sought to implement extremist ideas and practices in the tradition of the bloody French revolutions of centuries past. What helped Scruton overcome a merely Oxford-based English conservatism was not only his broader philosophical studies, but even more his connections with Soviet-occupied Central Europe from the late 1970s onward. Scruton's visits to Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest helped establish underground networks of intellectuals, including Jan Patocka. He was surprised to find that the small apartments of intellectuals living in poverty were filled with books by classical authors, and that knowledge of Plato, Kant, and even Heidegger was almost a matter of course. Conversely, his growing acquaintance with the artistic, literary, and philosophical traditions of Central European countries enriched his understanding of Central Europe as an essential part of Europe. Scruton saw the European Union as a kind of Moloch, a legally, economically, and politically absurd creation of post-war intellectuals with Marxist influences. Okay, I just skipped this. It should be noted that Scruton's growing acquaintance with Eastern Europe, in quotation marks, as he repeatedly calls it in his writings, led to his understanding of the importance of a continental Europe that is not France, not Germany or Italy. The second continental Europe is actually Central Europe, where Scruton was able to discover a rich culture of literature, philosophy, and music that helped him understand the nature of Europe as a multifaceted historical creation, even achievement. This discovery strengthened his opposition to the unaccountable European Union and made him aware of the importance of what is quintessentially European. What? Okay, sorry. Yes, quintessentially European. This is a quotation from Bryson's book. Scruton is a man who not only thinks but gives substance to this thinking, a public intellectual who has taken risks for freedom and who has never sought popularity when truth was at stake. To think with Roger Scruton is thus to think with someone who has spent a lifetime seeking comfort in uncomfortable truth. End of quote. Yes, Europe today. Jan Patocka lived in an oppressed country where the classical European traditions were more or less forbidden, even persecuted. This explains his view of Europe as a matrix of the classical tradition, as the bearer of the legacy of the care of the soul. It should be noted that Patocka was certainly a classicist, but his attitude towards religion was that of a skeptic. He acknowledged the importance of the pre-Protestant and Protestant movement in the formation of the Czech nation, but he confessed neutrality in religious matters. What he considers more important was the practice of continuous philosophical inquiry with a certain influence on the problems of the political community. The latter was the main reason why he initiated and signed the Carta 77 Declaration, after which he died as a result of political interrogation. Nevertheless,
Policy.
thank you. Policy interrogation, yes, which was also politically motivated, we can say. Yes. Okay. So, nevertheless, Patocka was a personal student of Edmund Husserl and followed many of the Austrian philosophers' important insights. His Habilitationsschrift, The Natural World as a Philosophical Problem, reflected the last period of his mentor's work when Husserl developed the concept of the life world as the basic layer of her experienced reality. Patocka, like many other followers of Husserl, didn't accept the transcendental reduction of the natural world, but offered a philosophical analysis that focused on the meaning of this world in our knowledge. That is, Patocka was not only a follower of the classical tradition, but also an interpreter in the context of contemporary philosophy. Similarly, Scruton appreciated modern philosophy, that is, the great thinkers of the European traditions. He published introductions to the work of Spinoza and Kant, and at the same time offered various critiques of more contemporary authors, such as Husserl, Heidegger, or Habermas. The study of Patocka helped him discover the meaning of the concept of the life world and intentionality, I should add here. And the study of Husserl led him to realize the importance of the concept of intentionality. Scruton appreciated Patocka's attempt to restore meaning to the human life through philosophy, especially the philosophy of the natural world. In Scruton's eyes, Patocka was one of the representatives of an approach that sought to restore the old values of European existence. He repeatedly mentioned Patocka's Platonic notion of the care of the soul. Of course, Patocka's central theme had a context in Central Europe. Husserl's Epoche, Max Schiller's Aufschwung, Heidegger's Sorge, Viktor Frankl's logotherapy are just a few examples of the common effort of some 20th century thinkers to return to the human person in order to raise him or her to a higher level of existence. Scruton tried to achieve something similar with a very strong line of criticism of thinkers who, in his view, misled humanity. The French postmodernists belonged to this group, and Scruton's sharp criticism of Badiou, Deleuze, or Foucault seems fully legitimate even today. Scruton repeatedly uses the term Eastern Europe in his writings. This shows the Atlanticist perspective I mentioned. In Understanding Music, this book, however, Scruton begins to use the term Central Europe throughout the book. This is easily explained by the fact that the discovery of Central European music, especially the work of Janáček, made Scruton realize the unique importance of Central European culture. It is in music that this culture appears so clearly as in the works of the most important composers from Liszt and Dvorak to Ligeti and Penderecki. Once Scruton understood the importance of Central Europe, it also became clear to him that the musical richness was only one aspect of a more complex cultural richness that originated primarily in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So, something about the redefinition of Europe today. Originally, the difference between Patocka's and Scruton's conceptions of Europe was quite significant. Slowly, however, Scruton discovered this terra incognita of Central Europe and realized the importance of the between, connecting West and East, a matrix in which new ideas are conceived and developed, a territory that Friedrich Neumann saw as essentially embryonic. Subsequently, Scruton and Patocka became closer in their interpretations. Although Scruton was still able to speak of Heidegger's dark metaphysics, he gradually understood that in Central Europe, philosophy is based on music, music and philosophy, and both are placed in the context of Ineinandersein, the intertwining of existence. Thus, Patocka's greater emphasis on Plato is in no way opposed to Scruton's emphasis on Kant. Both saw the preservation and development of classical traditions as important for the future of Europe, where harmony would reign and any kind of war would be eliminated as far as possible. In this slide, we can ask the important question: where does this ideal vision of Central Europe stand today? The answer seems very simple. Because of the terrible war in Ukraine, the vision of a peaceful and culturally flourishing Europe with an emphasis on Central European traditions seems to have disappeared. However, the situation is more complex. Patocka certainly knew this as he published writings on the terrible experience of war in the vein of Ernst Jünger. And he was aware of the prospect of a Nach Europa, a post-Europe, in which the classical traditions must be revived and relearned. In our current situation, we hear again and again declarations about the resetting of Europe in Ukraine. A reconstruction aimed at saving Ukraine and at the same time destroying the aggressor. If this is realized, Europe can be redefined and rebuilt in the form of a confederation, a union from Lisbon to Kharkiv at least. Is this the Europe that Patocka and Scruton would find desirable? As my old mentor, Rocco Buttiglione, would say, Jein. Yes and no. Of course, if we can end this war and save Ukraine from the aggressor, Europe will have to be redefined. In this case, the meaning of Central Europe will change. It will contain not only Lviv or Lvov or Lemberg, but also Kiev and Kharkiv. Not only Western Christianity, but also a good part of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In this case, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Krakow, and so on, will lose their significance as Central European cities. Warsaw and Bucharest, Lviv and Kiev will become much more important. This could lead to a cultural change given the difference between the old and the new parts of Central Europe. However, this scenario will certainly strengthen a new form of Central Europe with new prospects. If we look at the ideological background of current European efforts, we cannot be entirely optimistic. It seems that after the renaissance of conservative and modernizing tendencies, we are now witnessing the rise of authoritarian extremism as a continuation of the ideologies of the French revolts that shocked Scruton many decades ago. It seems that even beyond the level of past abuses, there is today a rise of a power-drunk demagoguery that Jan Patocka would call Trasimacchianism. We may call it by the even more common name of Machiavellianism, but it is not the names that matter. Rather, it is what we see here and now, namely the inconsistent militaristic ideologies that run counter to the traditional values of cooperation, respect, dignity, law, justice. It is Habermas' language of power, Machtsprache, or Derrida's intellectual violence that has become our daily encounter. It might be added, however, that this is only a temporary situation. As soon as the war is over and the aggressor withdraws, we will be in a position that not only to rebuild Europe, but also to revive generosity, tolerance, listening to others, and thus to expect a cultural revival. With Jan Patocka and Roger Scruton, I have to express some skepticism about this scenario. First, it is obvious that with the current situation, we have returned to the schizophrenic situation before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Second, the demagoguery accompanying the current military events in Europe is reminiscent of the worst days of the last century when entire populations were systematically misled by lie-generating ideologies. Third, the current situation definitely involves a loss of mesotes, middle position, balance, and soil from which a constructive culture can grow. If we really want to rebuild Europe, we cannot do without these features, namely the position of the mesotes, this is the Aristotelian concept, a balanced approach to various positions, and the real support of a humanistic culture based on our dedication to truth. At this point, I would like to refer to the 3-volume work entitled Europa Eterna, initiated and published in 1957 by Max S. Metz of Zurich. This work is an overview of the classical heritage or legacy of Europe with its local cultures, peoples, languages, and countries. The vision of the editor, supported by leading politicians of the time, is that after the terrible destruction of the Second World War, it was high time to take stock of our cherished traditions and heritage, to summarize them in a grand synopsis, and to support the young generation in continuing this heritage in new ways. The underlying idea of the editor is that Europe is eternal. Its culture is so rich and significant that we cannot risk losing it. Today we must recall the idea of Europa Eterna. We must understand its eternal significance and continue the work of our predecessors, from Plato to Heidegger, from Pergolesi to Gergely Bogányi, and so on. We cannot wait for another decade with a work of understanding, interpreting and opening the perspective of the new, a newness that is not against the old, but a continuation of it, as a child is the continuation of the parent or the fruit of the flower. It is our task to re-embrace the legacy of Jan Patocka and Roger Scruton in terms of the complete renewal of the European culture here in Central Europe. That is, it is our task here and now to realize Central Europe as our spiritual, moral, and practical ideal. The idea of the mesotes, so central to Plato and Aristotle, must be recaptured on the basis of further developments in Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, and others. Das Wahre ist das Ganze, as Hegel formulated it, and it is precisely in the context of Central Europe, understood as an embryonic ideal, that this whole, das Ganze, can be recognized, understood, and pursued. Of course, we are weak at the moment, but with Jan Patocka and Roger Scruton, we must believe in the power of the powerless. And here is the book. Thank you. Let me go.